Good evening, everyone. My name is Jay Parsons with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's webinar titled The Skills and Principles of Managed Grazing on Improved Pastures. This webinar is brought to you by the American Sheep Industry Association. We want to thank them for their support and encourage you to visit the ASI website to learn more about the sheep industry and to access the large volume of resources they have available there to help you be successful in the sheep business. The URL for the ASI website is www.sheepusa.org. If you're not currently a member of the American Sheep Industry Association, I'd like to encourage you to become one. Most people do that by joining their state sheep association. A list of the contact people for those associations is available on the ASI website under the contacts link. There's also a join link at the top of the page where you can read more about association activities and the benefits of membership. I'd like to remind our listeners that this webinar is being recorded. All webinar registrants will receive a follow-up email within the next 48 hours with a link to the webinar recording, as well as a link to access the webinar slides. The links will also be posted on the ASI website in the Let's Grow education materials. We're slated for about 45 to 50 minutes of presentation time this evening, followed by about 20 minutes of question and answer with our presenter. And you can feel free throughout the presentation and during the Q&A session to submit questions by typing them into the question dialog box at the bottom of your control panel, which usually shows up on the right-hand side of your screen. I will monitor those questions throughout the evening and moderate them to our presenter during the Q&A session after the presentation. You will also have the opportunity, if you prefer, during the Q&A session to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to the speaker. And I'll cover that again when we get to that part of the program. So in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and move on into our presentation. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Woody Lane here this evening. Dr. Lane is a livestock nutritionist and forage specialist with Lane Livestock Services in Roseburg, Oregon. And Dr. Lane is well recognized throughout the country as an expert in managed grazing on improved pastures. And so we're really glad to have him on here this evening to cover this topic with our listeners. Woody, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jay. It's a pleasure to be here again, and I'm really excited about sharing some of this material. And this is the type of topic that I go through all the time. And we're going to be talking about improved pastures. And for those who don't know me, I'm a private consultant, and I work a lot, hundreds and hundreds of pasture walks, and working with discussion groups and given many, many talks about this. And I've taught courses on forages and grazing throughout the West Coast. So with that, get right into it. This is a picture of Oregon, of the Willamette Valley, and during the winter when stuff isn't growing much. But on the other hand, it's not snow. So this is sheep on pasture, and that's what we're going to talk about. One thing is that this is not apply to range country. That's a whole different world. What I'm doing to discussing and describing is, the type of confined pastures with fences around them, and that you can deal with in terms of adding fertility or fertilizer or whatever you want. You can change the seeding. You can do these type of things, and then grasses grow. If you're out in the middle of Wyoming on range country, the stuff that I'm talking about does not apply. So let's get into it. How do we manage forages? If you take a look at the basic recommendations that you find, pick up an extension bulletin, something from the university, something from a seed company or something like that. They'll say what? When are you going to put your animals out on pasture? When you take them off? Well, for example, you put them in at when 8 inches, take them out at 3 inches, or some number like that. Put them in at 10, take them out at 4. It depends on the species. Not a big deal, but that's a standard thing. So you got, all right. So, for example, let's say you have a ewe raising twins in early lactation. All right, very simple. You're gonna have that. My question would be, how many inches of grass does that ewe need to meet her nutrient requirements? I need to manage this. I need to know how many animals are going to be out there for how long. So I need to know how many inches does she need? Well, right. How do you answer that? There's a deer in the headlight type of response, of course. What do you mean? There is no way. But because there's no way, here's a simple basic questions on running pastures. How long can 50 ewes graze a 15-acre paddock? Or how many acres are needed to support 50 ewes for 4 days? And if I'm working with inches, how am I going to be able to answer those questions? So basically, is there a better way? And the answer is yes, there is. How do we balance an animal's diet? Anyone here is anyone who's balanced a diet? You can raise your hand. Yeah. What do you do first? The first thing you do is you estimate, you identify the animal you want to have a diet for, and then estimate their intake or look it up what their dry matter intake is, and then in that package put the protein and energy that they're going to consume. So you're working on the amounts of stuff they do. So they work by weight, which is pounds of feed. Well, here's the deal. When we work with nutrition, we're working with pounds. When we're working with managing pastures, the basic recommendations are in inches. So the agronomic recommendations do not match what we do to recommend for diets. There's a complete disconnect, and because of that disconnect, we can't answer the basic questions on how to manage those pastures. Therefore, our best way of doing things is to manage forages by weight, not by inches. And this is what is done in New Zealand, Australia, parts of the UK, and around the world. And best grazers in the United States do the exact same thing. So here, we're going to do it by weight. How do we look at a pasture? Well, we look at how much is there. And how much is there, and the way I'm talking about it is the amount of dry matter. Say if a pasture is, it's mostly water, but you're going to have dry matter from 15 to 30% of that growing green pasture is going to be dry matter. And how much is out there? 3,000, let's say 3,000 pounds, which is 1.5 tons of dry matter per acre. Everything's per acre. So how do we measure this mass? And total mass means amount in terms of pounds. Well, very simple. We have a little square, and you cut the square and you weigh it and you dry it, and you can do that. And I won't go into that now, but that's the basic principles. So you got this square, which is not exactly 12 by 12, it's 12 by 11.5, which is a really cool thing because it helps with the calculations, the back calculations. That's 138 square inches. So let's say we cut this right to the ground to get the total mass, and we microwave it or use a fruit dryer to dry it down, and we get 26 grams of dry forage in this little box right here, 26 grams. So you got 26 grams per 138 square inches, which is not a very useful number. On the other hand, because of this 12 by 11.5, all you have to do is multiply that number by 100, which will give you 2,600 pounds of dry matter per acre. Now, if it was 12 by 12 inches, you would have to multiply it by 95.95, which is not exactly a memorable number. But 12 by 11.5, add 2 zeros. So now we got 2,600 pounds. We just measured that. All right. This is the type of pastures that I often work with. So here, basic thing. The total amount is out there, for example, in this case is 3,000 pounds. However, when you graze, you don't graze it all. You better not. Because what you end up doing is you have to leave some. And what you leave is what we call the residual mass, the residue. And if you're cutting hay, the residue is going to be pretty small. But if you're grazing, you have some choices. You can bring them off to pasture early, or leave pasture there. In any case, it's called the residual mass. So you've got a total mass, then you've got a residual mass. Now, if you take the total mass and minus the residual mass, you get what's they're going to graze. In this case, it's 2,000 pounds. So that's what's going to be. So that particular pasture has got 2,000 pounds of available feed mass per acre. So let's use that in some practical way. Let's say, for example number 1, because you can imagine there's probably going to be example number 2, right? Example number 1, you got a flock size of 125 ewes. 1 acre, we'll use the same number from the last slide, 2,000 pounds of available forage. That means there's 2,000 pounds of available forage that they're going to graze in that acre. So here's the numbers. Here's a basic principle. These weigh 160 pounds. It's an estimate. Now, here's the big deal. We're going to estimate their intake at 5% of their body weight. Now, 5% is high, granted, but we're not going to include the lambs on our side. We're not going to include how much we're not going to measure exactly how much she's going to trample into the ground. So we're taking an estimate that there's going to be a disappearance of forage about 5% of her body weight. In this case, 5% of 160 pounds is 8 pounds a day. If 125 ewes, that means 125 ewes at 8 pounds a day, they will graze 1,000 pounds of forage per dry matter, 125 times 8. If there are 2,000 pounds of available forage out there, and they're going to graze 1,000 pounds a day, how many days can they be out there? So 1 acre will give 2 days of grazing for that 125 ewes. And if I have a 3-acre field, I can put those ewes in there for 6 days. And I know this. I can estimate this before I open the gate. And that's very critical. Let's give another example. A lot of people have, smaller flocks and 20, 30, 40 ewes. So here's a flock size of 30 ewes. Same acreage, we got a same forage, you got 2,000 pounds of available forage. The ewes are a little larger this time, they're 185 pounds. We're going to estimate a 5% of their body weight, so that means that each ewe is eating about 9¼ pounds a day. Since I got 30 of them, 30 times 9¼ gives you 278 pounds of forage per dry matter per day they're going to eat, which means that if I divide 2,000 by 278, I get 1 acre will last 7 days for those 30 ewes. And therefore, a 2-acre field will be 14 days. Now, you can go how many hours and minutes, and yeah, 14 days, 9 hours and 22 minutes, but I don't think you want to get into that type of detail. In any case, so let's go on to something. Now, using the basic principle, let's go on and look at actually what happens. This is called the forage growth curve, which is absolutely basic to understanding what's going on. In this case, the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is the total forage mass. This is the total mass in the pasture. All right. So how do forages grow? They're going to start at 0, and then they're going to grow. Do they look like that? No, of course not. Forages don't grow like that. This line means that they're growing just as fast way down at the bottom, right at the beginning, as they are later on. And that doesn't make any sense. Do forages grow like this? No. How do forages grow? They actually grow like this in a pasture. Initially, what comes up is a little leaf, a little small plant, but then they add more leaves. And as they add more leaves, they can then add more leaves because they're photosynthesizing. They're adding more tissue mass. They're creating carbohydrates. They're bringing up nutrients from the soil, and they really go. And on a given day, they're really taking off. And then they get up to the top of this curve, and what happens there is that the top leaves are still photosynthesizing and they're growing, but the bottom are senescing, and they're not. The leaves are underneath; they're not getting sunlight. So the mass that's still increasing, the forage is still growing, but not as fast. So basically, this curve, which is called the S curve or sigmoid curve, is got 3 parts to it. And these parts would be this slower part at the beginning, the really fast, high-speed part here, and then this slower part, but the yield's way up there. And if we look at the amount of mass, you could say, oh, the slow part is about 1,000 pounds per acre. This break point here is about 3,000 pounds an acre. Now that's going to change depends on the time of year and the species. But this is rush rule. This gives you some numbers to build with. Now you'll come across this. We have to name these parts. Now we could have named them we could name them after the Three Stooges, but we didn't. Scientists named them phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, where phase 1 is this slow part, phase 2 is this really high speed growth part, and phase 3, which is the highest yield, is also more mature. And I won't go into the details because we don't have time, but this would be more mature. It will more and more as you get up here, more like a mature hayfield. All right. But this stuff here in phase 2 and phase 1 is really high quality vegetative growth. Just going back, this is a very important point. Just going back to looking at the pasture. When those numbers first came in, which was back in the early 90s, there were recommendations that came from New Zealand about how to equate pasture mass to inches. And the concept there was the lowest inch is going to be very dense, and then every inch above that's less dense, but it's they figure how much is there, and they figure 5 inches there'll be 1,000 pounds in the first inch per acre, 500 in every acre on top of that, and so a 5 inches would give you 3,000 pounds, and that was their rule of thumb. And you could walk there with your rubber boots and you could gauge basically how much is there. That was the idea. And I taught that. And I said, okay, if you got 5 inches and you got this, you can figure this out. And so people were using that in my classes, and they'd come back and said that didn't work. It would only last half as much. They didn't have pastures like that. Well, it turned out that what they had was something like this. Most of them didn't. Not even the first inch would be 800 pounds, and every other inch and 300 pounds. If you add this up, you only had 2,000 pounds per acre, not 3. And then most people were actually down here, which is what I normally see. That first inch is about 500 pounds, and every inch above that's 200 pounds, and you've got 1,300 pounds an acre. Now, if you want to graze and you want to leave 1,000 pounds of residual, and you start out with 1,300 pounds, you only have 300 pounds to graze in an available mass. That depends on how many animals. That could last you about 20 minutes. On the other hand, where this 3,000 pounds came from was highly fertilized New Zealand pastures that were primarily perennial ryegrass and white clover. Very dense, very highly fertilized, and based on that, they can make that recommendation. And well, basically, we didn't have that, not even close. And most people didn't even have this. They had more like this. Now, since then, there are a lot of pastures that come up to this level, and a lot actually have come up to equal anything that was in New Zealand. But this was interesting how the initial relationship between eyeballing it versus how much is there was very different. But the big thing is that one of the main points here is how dense the pasture is. If you make the pasture like a lawn, how dense it is, where there's no open ground between it, that's going to be pretty high. If you have a lot of open ground and you've got, especially with bunch grasses, you've got open ground and some weeds and slow growing weeds, you're going to not have that much feed out there. So the big thing here is this: how do we use this to manage the pastures and manage the grazing? This is the big thing, and this is probably the most important slide in this entire in the entire presentation tonight. Here's our forage growth curve. It comes up like this, a sigmoid curve. You got phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So here's what you do for good grazing on managed grazing on improved pastures. When do you put the animals in? You put them in there at the top of phase 2. That's when you put them in. And you graze in that field to the bottom of phase 2, and then you take them out. That is the crux of good grazing. It is the most efficient. From the plant's point of view, it's highly nutritious. We'll get into that. But this is what you should be doing to really manage your pastures, because you're leaving enough residual that those forages are going to explode right as soon as they got, if they've got, if they're fertile and they got sunlight, water, bang, they're right into phase 2 again. But here's what often happens. People keep putting their animals out there because there's still grass out there. There's still forage out there. So they graze further down. And now they're in phase 1. This is kind of like when you're shearing sheep. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are listening who know all about that. And shearing sheep, and there's still some wool there, so you cut it off on the second cut. No, you don't. No, you don't. This is the kind of the forage equivalent of a second cut. You graze down into here, and what happens is now the pasture is left in phase 1, which means that in order to grow again, it's got to make up this part here before it even gets into phase 2, and that means it might take a week or 2 weeks to get up there. Now that's a week or 2 weeks that's added on to the time before you can put the animals in again. So if that's a week or 2 weeks, let's say it's a week, or let's say it's 10 days. So that means you're adding 10 days to a rotation. And if you're going to be on that pasture, say 3 times during the year, and you've added 10 days to each rotation, basically you've lost 30 days of grazing. You've lost a month of grazing simply because you've overgrazed a little bit each time. I can't emphasize how important the concepts in this graph are. So here's an example. I took this just a couple of weeks, last month actually, about a month ago in Oregon. There's a bunch of sheep in the background you can see, and they're about to move from right to left. And you can see this is an primarily orchard pasture. There's probably good 3,000, 3,500 pounds of forage out there, but look how much they're leaving. They're probably leaving 1,200, 1,400 pounds of pasture, but that's okay. That's the way it works out. But they're not leaving 300 pounds, which most people would. A lot of pastures I look at, that's what they're down. So this stuff on the right is going to be exploding again, and probably within about 3 to 4 weeks, it'll be back looking like this. So the concepts we're talking about here are intensive grazing. And a lot of people, well, you could also call this management intensive grazing. And the concept of management intensive grazing, people think of you got a bunch of animals in small areas and you move them from area to area. So it's intensive grazing. So that's what people often think. That's not what this is. This is not intensive grazing. Animals, sheep, always graze intensively. When they're grazing, they always graze intensively. If you don't believe me, take some ewes and lambs, put them out there, they'll find a patch of clover, and see if the ewes kind of step back and let the lambs eat first, just because they're good moms. Yeah, right. Not in this earth. This is not management intensive grazing isn't intensive grazing. It's intensive management. It's a thinking person's approach towards managing and juggling the animal needs and what you want to do in your enterprise and raising the forages to support that, the feed. So it's intensive management. So so let's look at some specifics of that approach. And MIG is management intensive grazing. Don't mistake it for a Russian war jet. This is just management intensive grazing. Number one, introduce the sheep at the top of phase 2. Introduce the sheep into the pasture at the top of phase 2. Remove the sheep at the bottom of phase 1. For the residual, that's the amount that you leave, don't graze into phase 1. And anyone who's ever been through my courses, don't graze into phase 1. Don't graze into phase 1. I'm sure they wake up in the middle of the night thinking, don't graze into phase 1. This adds 7 to 14 days, 1 to 2 weeks to reach the bottom of phase 2. It also puts some stresses on some plants because depending on what plants they are, what forages, legumes, grasses, what type of grasses, what species, where they're storing their feed, where they're storing their feed. I mean, where they're storing the carbohydrates, and also where the growing point is. Some plants don't do well if you graze too much. And then of course, if some plants are stressed, they won't reproduce as well, or they'll fade out, and you end up having open areas in the pasture, and open areas means there's weeds. And weeds don't compete well in really well managed pastures. Weeds they don't last, with some exceptions, but most weeds won't last. But weeds often are an indication of inappropriate grazing. Avoid phase 3. Phase 3 is an older pasture. It's more like hay. It's also slower growing. So per day, it's added less dry matter onto that pasture, and that's a less efficient part of the grazing curve. So grazing in phase 2, it's the most efficient part of the curve in terms of how much forage is put on per day. And by the way, how much is there? Well, typically on an acre of pasture in the spring with good quality feed, you're going to gain anywhere from 70 to 100 pounds a day of dry matter per acre per day. Really good forages can do 115, 120. And that's not and the warm season grasses in the middle of summer will do better than that. Things like corn or sorghum Sudan grass. The nutrition in phase 2 is excellent. It's better than it's at least equal to anything that fast-growing lambs or ewes with twins and triplets. There might be you might need a little bit more on certain things, but this is excellent feed. Normally, the protein level on phase 2 is going to be at least 14, 16% or much higher than that. Sometimes in the spring, it'll be in the 20s. And forages in phase 2, they're healthy, they're sustainable, and they're growing fast, which is what you want. So here are the 4 basic rules of management intensive grazing. Number one, stay in phase 2 growth, which we just described at a lot. All right, stay in phase 2 growth. 2, leave enough residual. We're talking 800 to 1,000 pounds of dry matter an acre. Now, there are times you could break that. There's times that you can use that amount of residual to manage, for example, in the spring where you don't want the tidal wave to hit you all at once. So you set some pastures back because you want them to be slower. You could do that. On the other hand, you can also, I'm going to renovate this pasture in next fall, next spring, so I can hammer it and get the residual down to 0. But you know what you're doing. You plan for that. Number 3, protect the regrowth. Protect the regrowth. We'll get to that in a moment. I call it the 5-day rule. And I have a 5-day rule about that. Regrowth means after you graze something or cut it, how fast does the new green shoots come back? We'll get to that in the next slide. And finally, the 4th rule is the water and the minerals move with the sheep. So for every grazing cell, there's the water there and there's the minerals there. So the sheep aren't going back to the barn every night unless you're dealing with, coyotes and wolves, and you have to. There might be other reasons for that. But in normal grazing, they're not going back to someplace. They're not drinking out of the creeks, because if you do that, you can't move the sheep too far away from the creeks. You want to have each grazing cell is self-contained, and there are ways of doing that. So here's a 5-day rule, and this goes back to what intensive grazing is versus set stocking. How many of you have watched grass grow? You can raise your hand. I can't see a thing. Yeah, well, watching grass grow is kind of like watching paint dry, right? Well, next time, so here we're in the summer now. So next time, when you mow the lawn or cut something or watch it, get the animals off a pasture and it's watered and it has fertility, go out there every day and take a look at it. How many days goes by before you start seeing green shoots? Probably 4 or 5 you start to see them. Certainly by 6 or 7 you should. Now, if you start seeing green shoots and you still have animals in that paddock and all they're doing is walking around looking for something to eat, what do you think they're going to eat first? They're going to eat those green shoots preferentially, which that means that you're putting stress on exactly the type of plants that you want in your pasture. So the concept there is get the animals out in 5 days. The most of the animals should be in a grazing cell is 5 days. Now, again, we're talking about improved pastures here. It has nothing to do with range country. It has nothing to do with a number of different ways of, there's some places like here in Oregon and Western Oregon in the Willamette Valley, there are animals, they're grazing, seed fields where you'll have a pure stand of tall fescue or orchard grass no, we're not talking about those type of situations. We're talking about your basic pastures that people have on farms. 5 days, 5-day rule. No grazing of regrowth. That's why you're getting animals off. You're going to protect the regrowth. This is the 3rd rule in intensive grazing. Because if you let the animals eat the regrowth, you're putting selection pressure against your very best plants. Those are the ones that come back quickly. And what you're doing is weakening them by eating their early regrowth. Now, there's a lot of jargon in grazing, and there's something that just came out in the Stockman Grass Farmer. Someone just wrote a long article about all the different types of grazing there is. All right, and there's a lot more terms than this, but there's creek grazing, a multi-species grazing, and forward grazing, high-low grazing, first and second grazing, whatever. If you take a class in agronomy or forage management in the university, you got to memorize this and get them back on a test. And they all have reasons, and they all make sense. But from my point of view as a grass manager, I don't care what the strategy is. I don't care how many species there are, which follows whom, whichever. I want the animals off that grazing cell in 5 days. Now that could be put the lambs in for 2 days, take them out, put the ewes in for 3 more days, then get them out. Yeah, that's fine. But what you could put cattle in and hogs following cattle or chickens following sheep or whatever, in and out 5 days. What you don't want is put animals in, take them out, and about 6 or 8 days later, put the next group in. Oh my God, they're going to walk right in there and hit all the regrowth. So that 5-day rule, keep it in mind. No livestock in the grazing cell after 5 days. There are a couple of species of grasses that don't work well with intensive grazing. Timothy and smooth brome are two of them, mainly because they got high growing points, or they raise those growing points. In fact, all the bromes raise those growing points at that's the species characteristic. So they raise their growing points, and if you're doing intensive grazing, management intensive grazing, you're moving animals around in various ways, and at one point or another, you're going to put animals in that grazing cell just when those species are most vulnerable to losing their grazing points. What happens is that after a couple of years, they fade out of the system because they can by when you eat the grazing points, the plants will come back, but they come back slower for various botanical reasons, physiologically. Nonetheless, we found in practice that plants like Timothy and smooth brome don't do as well in a management intensive grazing situation. So I won't go into all the details on that, but some species do extremely well. Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, orchard grass, most of the clovers. In fact, clovers do even better because you're opening up the sward all the time. So in any case, this is practical stuff, and we'll get into some very practical things. In fact, I'm going to get into one of the more practical parts of this in a couple of moments. I'm not sure what the stocking rate with dogs is, but this is a nice pasture, and I wish if everyone had 100 acres or something like this would be good. This is actually this Balansa clover, Balansa, in the springtime, which is it's a winter annual, but you can see what it looks like. The dog was not grazing, by the way. This is just a scene in North Island in New Zealand in Hawke's Bay area. So here's something that's very practical, like the other stuff wasn't, right? Does anyone have any gates on their property, or have ever had to go through a gate? Did you ever have to untangle something like that? And after you do, especially if it's not yours, you're kind of going grumble, grumble, and doing it all day long. Well, there's a better way. And I don't know if you've seen this thing before, but this is a gate latch. This is actually you'll see it as a New Zealand design gate latch, and it is. The last time I was in New Zealand, which was just about 2 years ago, I traveled 1,800 miles through North Island, just basically looking at gate latches, among other things. And I saw probably 95% of all the gates had latches like this. This is very, very simple, beautifully designed thing. Basically, you need an opposing thumb to open it up, but you can open it with one hand. And until livestock evolve so they get opposing thumbs, we're good on this. So you can get these things in the United States. You got to look, but here, and this one's been on for a while. They're sold by, I know at least 3 places that sell them, and they come like this. They come with a chain, the gate thing, and these large staples. They're really big staples. And there you go. How can you get that in the wood? That's real simple. You drill some pilot holes, put them in, and then I found, and I've got them on my own place. You drill a pilot hole, drill pilot holes for both wings of that, get them, and then just before you hammer them in, put a little bit of axle grease on the edge, and they go right in, and they will not pull out. They're big staples. Or you can use an eye bolt that'll work just fine, or any other ways. But basically, you can get these things. And the 3 places that I know that have them and are Jeffers Veterinary Supply, Valley Vet, and Gallagher. Gallagher's tend to be about, I don't know, these things run between $5 and $13, a latch. The Gallagher ones tend to be a little bit heavier made, but and then the price in New Zealand is, in terms of buying, is the same as here. So I would get a couple. Get 1 or 2. It's a no-brainer from my point of view. The good thing about these gate latches is that they work. They're easy. You always figured out how to put them on. And the thing is that you figure if you go through a gate, how many times you go through gates during the day? Every time you drive through one, you're going to open it to get your vehicle in. Then you have to close it. and latch the gate. Then when you come back out of the field, you got to do it again. So you're using that gate latch 4 times every time you go into a field with a vehicle or something. So if you can save 20 seconds every single time you do that, how many times a day times 365 days? This is a good thing. The other thing that I found, that when I use these things, I smile when I go through them, and that's not such a bad deal. On the other hand, there is something in physics called string theory, which is an advanced thing in physics. And this particular rancher is using string theory to be a gate, and that could work too. Kind of depends on how you approach some of these concepts. So with that, this is a nice picture. This is actually in North Island, north of Auckland, in New Zealand. That's perennial ryegrass, white clover here. It's a winter scene, by the way. This stuff here is kikuyu grass, which is a C4 grass out of that's in Hawaii, but it's also in New Zealand, and it's probably one of the best grasses I know, but we can't grow it here in the continental United States. But let's talk about some no-nonsense tools. These are building on the principles that we have. Here's some very basic, very solid tools using pasture mass. Here are these tools: stocking rate versus stocking density, water and minerals, dry matter intake, a rule of thumb for that, something called a grazing wedge, and also some new terminology that you've probably not seen before. Definitions: stocking rate, and I'm sure pretty everyone's heard this. It's number of animal units and over time, and an animal unit is a cow. Well, there's a couple of definitions for it, but basically it's the one that's often used the most is a cow, 1,000-pound cow with a calf along her side. And they equate 5 ewes to a cow. And it wasn't because someone couldn't count body weight. 5 ewes, 150, 160-pound ewes does not equal a cow. But it's not by weight, it's by intake. And sheep eat more per body weight than cows. Their dry matter intake as a percent body weight is a little higher than cows. So 5 ewes was considered, when this was first figured out, as a 5 ewes per cow. And in terms of the use of feed. Any case, and putting on one animal unit for a month of grazing is called AUM. The purpose of the stocking rate of AUMs is for being able to charge fees for grazing on public lands, and also for other types of grazing when you're renting. How many animals do you have out for how long? That's very, very important in range country. It's very important in public land because you don't have much other tools except how many animals you put out for how long and where they are. I mean, you can't replant easily. I mean, you're not going to manipulate the fertility of a range country, and you're not going to manipulate the species. So you have very few tools, stocking rates than one of them. That's very important there. But what do you do in a pasture in Kentucky or North Carolina or Vermont or Western Oregon on a typical farm? Family farm, you have sheep on it for a little bit, and then you take them off and they'll do something else. They'll be in a barn for a while, they're lamb or something. And you might replace them with, you bring in a small load of stocker cattle, and then you take them out and you put in some horses, and you also put some hay in there with the horses, just because you want some hay, you don't want them to founder, etc., etc. So on a given field or in a place, you've got animals coming and going, different species, and then of course you're throwing hay over the fence as well to feed them. So what does stocking rate mean? Not very much. I don't know how to calculate it like that. And if you get a number, what does it mean? Well, that's all fine and dandy, and they need it, realtors like to have it so they can tell someone how many animals the animal place can carry, maybe. But there's a better number. This is called stocking density. The stocking density does not have a time component in it. It is essentially how grazing pressure. What is something like at that moment? Basically, how many pounds of animal are out on that pasture at that moment? It's number of pounds of livestock per acre at a single point in time. It's essentially a way of expressing grazing pressure. For example, a stocking density of 5,000 pounds means that there are 25 ewes at 200 pounds per ewe per acre, or one 5,000-pound cow. I mean, or I guess there are elephants, or a small elephant will do it. Nonetheless, that is called stocking density. That's very important. That tells you about grazing pressure. For example, let's take 50 ewes, 150 pounds. That's 7,500 pounds of livestock, of sheep. If they're grazing on 5 acres, 7,500 pounds divided by 5 means 1,500 pounds an acre. Your stocking density is 1,500 pounds. That's all it is. And the good thing about that is it doesn't have to be ewes. It could be cattle. It could be goats. It could be horses, although horses graze a little differently. These are based on 4-legged animals. I do not know what the stocking density is for poultry, but that's a different type of question. But let's take a look. Let's say you got 50 ewes, 150 pounds. You got a 5-acre field. This green thing is a 5-acre field. All fields are square, so don't worry about it. It's a 5-acre field. 50 ewes, 150 pounds is 700. So that's 7,500 pounds. Divided by 5, the 5 acres gives you a stocking density of 1,500 pounds an acre. All right. Let's put a fence halfway down it. So now I've gone from 1,500 pounds to 3,000 pounds because I got those same 7,500 pounds, but now in only half an acre. So my stocking density has gone up to 3,000 pounds. You can tell where this is going. Cut it in half again. Now my stocking density is 6,000 pounds an acre. I cut it in half again. Now my stocking density is 12,000 pounds an acre. Cut it again, 24,000 pounds an acre. Cut it again, 48,000 pounds an acre. That doesn't mean the sheep are shoulder to shoulder and can't move. Not at all. Not even close. But look at this. Which of these do you think is going to have more weeds growing? Which of these do you think is going to have a much tighter grazing where the whole area is grazed evenly? Which of these is going to have a more evenly spread manure across the entire thing? Which of these is going to leave where the animals have the luxury of leaving stuff they don't like? For example, tall fescue and reed canary grass, or Serratia lespedeza. They're going to leave that because they've got the luxury. Which of these will they have a choice between eating chocolate and Brussels sprouts? All right. Stocking density is a good tool. So here's some practical guidelines I can graze tall fescue, which is notoriously not very palatable compared to some other grasses. Well, you get the stocking density about 15,000 and they'll graze tall fescue just fine. This is assuming they're in phase 2. All right. What about other weeds? Well, you can graze, if you increase the stocking density, you can graze a lot of weeds. And if you have dry ewes, you can put your stocking density 100,000 pounds and you can take out a lot of weeds. Really. What about when you plant seed? One of the techniques of planting seed is it's called the tread-in method. That's also known as the hoof and tooth method, which means you put the seed on the ground, the top of the ground, and kind of moist ground, and you put the seed and then put the animals on it so they let them hoof it in. Well, a low stocking density won't have enough hooves per square foot. We found that about 25,000 to 30,000 pounds per acre is enough to do that. And that's a rule of thumb. What about intensive grazing? Management intensive grazing. Well, people who are using management intensive grazing, whether it's cattle, sheep, or goats, are going to have stocking densities of over 60,000 pounds or more. They're not shoulder to shoulder. So it's not like they're like we've seen political rallies where the stocking density is much higher than 60,000 pounds an acre. So they're not like that. But they're often above 100,000. Yeah, management intensive grazing. It's a very, very good way of handling forages, but you got to know what you're doing. And then you've heard of mob grazing, which is even higher, and your stocking densities of 200,000 pounds or more. I work with at least one sheep operation that does that periodically, a couple of months during the year. This is a good example of mob grazing. There's about 150,000 pounds an acre in this one. That doesn't mean you need 150,000 sheep. It just means that's how much pounds per acre. This is a winter scene in New Zealand. This is not, it's an overgrazed field, of course, but it's in the middle of the winter, and there's high stocking densities. And here's another practical tip, very practical tip. I said in rule number 4 with the management intensive grazing, water and minerals move with the sheep. Every grazing cell contains water and the trace mineral mixture. Well, here's something I found out about a year, and I started using it on my property, and I found this out from a ranch that's using this. And it's something you might want to look at. I'll tell you that. This ranks right up there with the New Zealand gate latch. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but this is a watering thing, a watering system for about 250 ewes. That's what they use. And this here is called a Hudson valve. And effectively it operates on the same principle as the toilet, with the float, but it's a little more sophisticated than that, but it's basically the same principle. And you buy this, I think they're about $30 on Amazon, and you get this black thing, and then you put the whole rest of it together by typical hardware you can get. And so that's the front of it. And what happens is it fills up with water right about to there and then stops. So the animals drink out of this thing, but it keeps on refilling with water. It just keeps on flowing, and it never gets higher. It never gets higher than this. It works like a charm. And the back of it is in the back like that, and it's attached with not very high tech. On my case, I copied these guys and used 2 wires, drill some holes, 2 wires. You need the 2 wires so that this thing doesn't shift upwards and kind of go in all directions. The 2 wires, see one there, and there's one there and one there. You can see that, and so it holds it in place. So that's called a Hudson valve, and I suggest you look into that. I got it from a place that uses it actually for thousands of sheep, and they have about one for every 250. I just used mine. I just had 30 sheep on my property, and I used it. Worked flawlessly, and I was able to go out there, check it, but I didn't have to deal with water. Work with water. This also means too is that you can get water everywhere with hoses or your friends. With these and this, you can put water anywhere on your property. And you can have a couple of 100 feet of hose. That's not a big deal for drinking water. Any case, so here's a nice pasture. We all should have this. So here's a rule of thumb for estimating dry matter intake, which is what we talked about at the beginning of the talk. How much do sheep eat on pasture? Basic rule of thumb. I usually start with a dry matter intake of about 5% of the body weight. For example, 200 ewes, they average 160 pounds. 200 ewes makes 32,000 pounds. At 5% of their body weight, that means they're eating 1,600 pounds a day. That's a starting place to estimate how long you're supposed to keep your animals in a property. If you're off, well, maybe 4%. Try it 4%. 4% of the same number of 32,000 pounds is 1,280 pounds a day. You get the idea. These are general rules. These are ground rules. These are the type of thing you do on the back on a tractor, and or in the pickup truck, and you're looking out, or in a 4-wheeler, and you're looking over your sheep and going, how much are they going to eat? This is not the same as looking up the NRC, which is the National Research Council, and looking up the specifics, because they're going to list ewes anywhere from 1.4 to 3.9%, and growing lambs can go up from 1.4 to 7.8% of their body weight. Those are listed in the tables. Those are dry matter intakes. Those are not requirements. Animals don't have dry matter requirements, but they're estimate of intake, right? We're not dealing with that type of specificity. We're feeding with a front end loader, all right? And we're trying to measure pastures, and we're taking this 5% or 4% is disappearance of pasture per ewe, including trampling, including the lambs. We're not worried about the lambs. We're just counting ewes, looking at body weight, taking an estimate, and going from there. Then there's another thing that we use, another tool that we use for intensive grazing. It's called a grazing wedge. And this is for places that have lots and lots of different paddocks, because paddocks grow at different rates. They have different species in them. They have different fertility. Some are wetter than others, so they don't all grow the same rate. So if someone puts up a rotational grazing system on a whiteboard or something, and they move their animals nicely from cell to cell, and then they come back to the cell, world doesn't work that way. That's nice on a whiteboard, but it does not work that way in real life, because which is the next place you're going to move the animals? You got a whole bunch of different forages. Which way are you going to move them? How are you going to jump next? Well, it depends on what's out there, because management intensive grazing is allocating feed to the animals, and you need to have the feed in the next paddocks. So how do you do it? Well, on a given week, in this place, they got 25 paddocks. So they got 1 to 25, they're numbered. And they go through, and they, on a given day, they take estimates of how much feed is in each one. And you can see on the total mass, this is your total mass. So like number 2, it's got like about 750 pounds of feed. Number 1 had about 2,300 pounds of feed. Okay, and you go that, and you write it down on a clipboard or whatever else, right? Okay. and then you put them in a spreadsheet. And you have, and on one column you have your paddock number, and the second column you have how much is in each paddock. And then you graph it, and spreadsheets do this very well, right? Well, this graph doesn't mean very much because they're bouncing all over the place. So what we can do with a spreadsheet is reorder, resequence these numbers. Instead of being the number from 1 to 25, we can sequence it in terms of high to low. So here's the high one, here's the low one, and we tell the spreadsheet to do that and then graph it. So now here's the high one, which is pasture number 25. There it is right there, 25. And the second one is 24, which is right there. And the third one is 9, which is right there. So basically, we've just ordered it. And then we've drawn a line at the points in the forage growth curve that changes from phase 1 to phase 2, and phase 2 to phase 3. So here's the top of phase 2, here's the bottom of phase 2, and here we have this graph. And if you think about this, doesn't that look like a doorstop? I don't mean the red part, but the graph there. It's a doorstop, which is also called a wedge, and this is a grazing wedge. And the whole concept is you're trying during the growing season is to stay inside the wedge. These pastures here, you don't go there, because by the time you go there, these things are going to get up to phase 3. So what you do here is you cut them, either cut them for hay or top them off and knock them down, whatever you do. But here's your next moves. The next 5 moves are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then a week later, you go through and do it again because everything's going to change a little bit. And you get down here and you overgraze. You don't, what's going on here? You overgraze this one. Oh my gosh. So this doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you got 20 ewes and just 3 acres. No. But if you've got a couple hundred ewes or more, and you've got 15, 20 different or more different paddocks, this becomes extremely useful because it tells you the next few moves. And they won't necessarily be the adjacent ones. They are whatever's growing when they're growing. And this is going to change over the course of the season because not every year is it going to be exactly the same. Some years are rainier than others. And I understand that there's certain places in the East Coast that are now drowning. And if you'd like to send some of that rain to the West Coast, we really appreciate it. In any case, so you got some choices to make. Yeah, I had to pay the this bison a little extra to stand there. It's overtime. So I'm going to share one more thing with you, and then we're going to open it up for questions in a moment. How do you describe someone's grazing operation? Well, it'd probably take you about 5 minutes to go through all the different things or write it out. So a couple of years ago, Dennis Hancock, who was a forage specialist was the forage specialist in Georgia and is now head of the dairy forage lab in Wisconsin. He and I put together this way of being able to describe pastures, a way to describe an operation. Now, this doesn't make sense to you right now, but it will in a moment. These mean something. For example, RG, it's a rotational grazing system. We move this, in this case, we're moving stock every 2 days with a stocking density of 45,000 pounds. That tells you a lot because, for example, it might be what happens if you had a set stocking system, you moved them every 60 days with a 2,000 pound stocking density. And you can describe that simply by those 3 numbers. So, and I'll end with this. Those of you who don't know, I've written 2 books. From the Feed Trough is one, that's a nutrition book. And much of what I've covered just now is in this book that just came out right at the beginning of the pandemic, Capturing Sunlight. I'm in the process of writing book 2 on this as well. And these are articles of those of you who read The Shepherd. These are articles that I've been in The Shepherd, and they've been rewritten for these books and copy edited, which is like having an English teacher stand over your shoulder. But they're sold as paperback and as ebooks. Amazon has them, Premier has them, yeah, has both of them. Mid-States has the nutrition book right now. Hopefully they'll have the Capturing Sunlight soon, and there's some other places as well. But I'm on Amazon. You can type my name in it, and you'll find them. They're about, it depends on what they're, $20 to $28. The ebooks are $7 or $8 or $9. But I would suggest a lot of what I covered today is right in this Capturing Sunlight book. So you might want to take a look at it, tell your friends. And Christmas is coming up in a few months, and so it's always good to give someone something. Um, and I think with that, uh, Jay, we are at a point where I've spoken pretty quickly, covered a lot of stuff, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. There's a lot of information there to digest. So we'll go into our Q&A session here now. We have about a half dozen questions to answer that were submitted while you were talking, and I'll just take them in the order that they were submitted through your presentation. Um, just a reminder, you can ask questions of Woody by using the question box, which is over on your control panel, which usually by default is over on the right-hand side. You might have moved that or have it placed someplace else, but there should be a question box where you can type in questions. If you'd like to ask Woody your question directly, just raise your hand. There's a little hand symbol, and if you raise your hand, then I will call on you and unmute your microphone, and you can just talk to him directly. And so I'm going to go ahead and get right into these questions, and we've probably spent about 20 minutes on these, Woody, and see what we got there, what will flow in. So the first question that came in was when you had the square, the 12 by 11.5-inch square, and you clipped it to the ground. The question was, is there a reason why the hand clipping method cuts all the way to the ground and not to the grazer's managed height? Can you hand clip to say 3 inches to get an estimate of what's out there if you're grazing down to 3 inches?
Well, it's a very good question. It's a very practical question. And the reason I always want to deal with a total mass. I mean, you can do whatever you want if that's what you like. But if you deal with total mass, you know exactly what's out there, and you can make decisions based on that. You might not always want to graze down to 3 inches. I mean, I want to graze a certain mass, and 3 inches for a certain type of forage. For example, if you have a tall fescue based type of pasture, 3 inches is going to be very different than a white clover perennial ryegrass pasture, which is going to be very different than Bermuda grass pasture. So 3 inches may be very different in different places. And when you are reading references, let's say from New Zealand or anything like that, they're talking in terms of amounts. So being able to know how much is out there total, you know exactly where you are in the forage growth curve. And then you make your decisions based on that. But if you feel comfortable at 3 inches there, I mean, there's no one standing over your shoulder saying, and pointing at you and saying, don't do it that way. You do it any way you want. I find the most useful way of doing it is getting a number for total mass.
Okay, good. And then we had some questions come in on your phase curve, your phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Christine asked how you handle the first rotation when you can't get your animals through a full rotation before you're well into phase 3. And I think, when you had the grazing wedge up there at the end, you had some that were awful close to entering into phase 3. Any thoughts on that in terms of trying to get through those first few rotations without having grass move to phase 3?
Well, I've just been trying to get to that point. Okay, so if I was kind of fooling with the mechanics here, and I wasn't listening, I couldn't hear the whole question. So essentially, what you're saying is you're up here somewhere, and why don't you repeat the question, because I was kind of fooling with the technology.
Okay, yeah. Basically, if you are, how do you handle when the first rotation in particular,
Yeah,
when you can't get your animals through a full rotation before you're well into phase 3? So, for example, you mentioned haying the first 2 fields
yeah.
here on the left, but you got 2 more fields that are right at the edge of phase 3 already. Do you split the animals up? How should you handle that situation? Any rules of thumb?
Use a tractor, cut them,
Okay.
top them off. I mean, you top them off. You can either take hay from it. Of course, that's removing nutrients. Or you just cut it. You just lay the stuff down, and recognize why did it get there, And sure, it's springtime. You get the tidal wave of stuff. Think about what that means, though. Maybe, and can you see my screen and my cursor here?
Sure can.
Okay, so these fields here maybe have really good spring growth. Maybe they should be the first ones grazed in the spring and grazed down into phase one on purpose so that they slow down and they don't get up to this area here while everything else is getting up there at the same time. So this is where we can use the total mass. We use the knowledge of that and being able to actually set certain fields back on purpose. Now, some fields, for example, on a south-facing slope are going to be maturing faster or growing quicker earlier than the fields that have a heavy wet ground. It's colder temperature, right? So maybe those would need to be grazed first and also grazed at into phase one to slow them down. And so there's all sorts of ways of trying to deal with it, but the question is a very good one because you're recognizing the fact that that's exactly the type of issue we have to deal with, particularly in the spring. But we now have some tools we can visualize what's going on across the entire farm and then know what to do, what techniques we can use on which fields, or just take these fields and just make hay out of them. I mean, there's a bunch of different techniques you can use to deal with that. It's a common, it's an issue. Springtime. As one person said, any fool can grow forage in May, but the end result is that you get this tidal wave of forage.
Okay, and a follow-up question to that is mowing behind the rotation. In particular, if you have a bunch of trampled forage out there, is there a reason or should people mow behind it after the first rotation when they have a lot of trampled forage in order to get to phase two more quickly after the first rotation? I don't know if I phrased that right, but
yeah, I see your point. You got basically tall stuff that's knocked down.
yeah.
And you go, what do? You could do that. Depends on the forages you have. It depends, and if you got that much knocked down left over, did you understock that particular area? I mean, why is there so much residual on the ground? I mean, knocked down. You might want to ask yourself that. Perhaps the stocking density was much too low, and they just knocked down the taller stuff. If you increase the stocking density by a lot and you could try this on your own. I mean, take an electric fence or netting or whatever and tighten it up really a lot. See what happens. Of course, get the animals off when they reach the top of the bottom of phase two. But if you have a whole bunch of forage down on the ground, I mean, I'm not sure what I would want to go through and put machinery on that and cut it. It also acts as a cooling. That amount of forage can act as helps to keep the evapotranspiration less, so stuff doesn't dry out. So there's a bunch of things to weigh on that one. But I would also use that as potentially a lesson and ask yourself, why is that happening? Is the stocking density too low? Have I waited too long to get the animals out there? Am I dealing with reed canary grass, which gives me about 15 minutes of growth? I mean, of grazing. Otherwise, it gets to become bamboo. I mean, any number of questions, and that would be a really good field to go to on a pasture walk to discuss that and how it fits into that particular farm.
Okay, and another very practical question about those growth phases. Person says, I'm unclear on how to distinguish between the growth phases. Could you please explain again? And in particular, I think they're referring to, you went to the 1,000, 3,000 pound thing fairly quickly after you were going through those at the beginning, but that doesn't match your situation. How do you distinguish practically between phase 1 and 2 and phase 2 and phase 3?
Well, from a point of view of actually looking at the pasture and going, wow, that's a matter of here you go. That's a matter of experience. However, knowing what knowing and being familiar with the concept of pasture mass and how much, 1,000, 2,500, 3,000. And by the way, an important thing, if you ever read stuff from New Zealand, Australia, or England, they don't talk in terms of pounds per acre. They talk in terms of kilograms per hectare. A hectare is 2.48 acres, and a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. The good thing is that you can say they're essentially equivalent. So like your seeding rate, fertilizer rate, stocking density, pounds per acre is about the same as kilograms per hectare. And I'm saying this as an aside, not that's not an answer to the person's question, but is a teachable point. Now, if you're familiar with the concept of pasture mass, then it's amount of measuring that mass and getting used to doing that. And one way you can do that is you go through the process of having your little square, and this is the way we teach it and we use it very effectively, is that you do this pasture mass and you go through the whole process and you get these numbers and it says 2,600 pounds per acre. Well, the point is this: you're not going to take 50 of them and take an average. No, no, no. What you do is you take one and know what it looks like. And then you now know what 2,600 pounds an acre looks like on that field. And the idea is about 1,000 pounds is the break point. About 2,500, 3,000 pounds is the other break point. So knowing the concept of how much is there, that's what you need to know when you're trying to figure out where are you in phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3. That's basically it. Now let's take a look at phase 3. Let's think about a hay crop, a hay field, and you cut it. If you cut a hay field, let's say you get 2 tons of hay from a field. I think people understand. I mean, they have a fair thing in their head what 2 tons of hay looks like, right? All right, 2 tons of hay is 4,000 pounds, right? Let's say it's 10% moisture. So 4,000 pounds minus 10% moisture gives you 3,600 pounds. That's 3,600 pounds of dry matter. That's phase 3. You now know what phase 3 looks like. So it takes some practice. You're not going to do it the first time, but equate it to the amount that's out there. And different species are going to be different. If you come early spring growth, you're not going to get to 3,000 pounds. You might only get to 2,500, but then again, you're not getting to phase 3 in March. So, knowing this and having this under your belt as the framework, then you're able to look at a pasture, and if you can get the numbers, you go, okay, and if that's 600 pounds, you're in phase 1. If it's 1,200, 1,800, 2,000, you're in phase 2 somewhere. Phase 2 it's very good pasture. When someone says this is ready for grazing, it's probably in phase 2.
Okay, and then we had some questions come up on the animal unit calculations or just definitions of them. You had one animal unit was a 1,000-pound cow with a calf, and then you said that was equivalent more or less to 5 ewes. Question came in: is that a ewe with a lamb, or does that make a
No,
difference?
it makes no difference. It's 5 ewes. This is set by law. It's a regulation. It's
Yeah,
I mean, it's something.
that
It's
must
called
be one of them Oregon laws.
No, it's federal. It was originally set when they had the whole forest reserves, but basically it's the
Right.
PREA, the Public Rangelands Improvement Act,
Yep.
and it's essentially it's ewes and cows,
Mhm.
and they don't care about lambs, you know. And besides, I don't deal with it because I'm not dealing with rangeland. Animal units have their own need and their own use for it. I'm dealing with what goes on in improved pastures.
Right, and those that are familiar with the reservations know that their grazing units are sheep units, and of course it takes 5 sheep units to make a cow unit. So,
Yeah,
yep.
the cow units, sheep units. But again, what does that mean on a farm? This guy, it's moving animals around all over the place, and has just added, uh, you know, 200 units of nitrogen on one field and phosphorus on a different field, and you got reed canary grass on some fields and Bermuda grass on different fields. How does that all fit? It doesn't. Not. I mean, it becomes this exercise that might be academic, but not very useful, practical.
Okay, related to that, you mentioned 5% body weight dry matter intake for ewes, lactating ewes, I believe you might have mentioned, but anyway, for ewes, is it different for finishing lambs? Does that 5%
Now,
change any?
the 5% is not precise. You want a precise thing, go to the NRC, go to a nutritional reference book, and you'll get precision. We're not dealing with precision here. We're dealing going, how many days can I put these animals out there for? So how much feed is out there, which is your total mass, and how much is available mass, and how much do the animals eat? So how much animals, meaning disappearing, how much do they trample? How much, if you got ewes and you got triplets, she's going to eat a little more than ewes would have singles, of course. So we're going to overestimate the whole thing. And she might eat, you know, 3.2% of her body weight, and the lambs might eat 5% of their body weight, but they're much lighter. You could go crazy trying to get all those numbers together. You just take the average ewe weight, add them all up. You get, this is the weight of that mob of sheep, of ewes. Take 5% of it, and then move on. You're not trying to use three. I was just joking when I said be on there for 21 hours, and I mean 5 days and 21 hours and 18 minutes. I was pulling everyone's leg, but the end result is we don't do that. What we do is we take general averages so we can make decisions on pasture management.
Okay, good. So we do have one person that's had their hand up. Donnie, you've had your hand up for a while here. I don't know if you're ready to ask a question or not, but I'm going to go ahead and well, I can unmute you, Donnie. So if you're wanting to ask a question, now's the time to unmute yourself. And it doesn't look like he did that. So I'm going to assume that he doesn't have a question. Okay, so we had a question on the manipulating stocking density. I'll just read it to you. What is the point of manipulating stocking density if your stocking rate isn't appropriate? I would argue that getting the stocking rate right is more important than effects of stocking density. Would you like to address that?
Well, you can argue it all you want, but stocking density is what you actually do at that moment to manage a particular field. Stocking rate is not relevant. Stocking rate's over time, and it's over the entire operation. If I have a 10-acre field, and I'm going to try to plant something on it, and I'm going to try to tread it in, stocking rate means nothing. Stocking density gives me how many hooves per, how much weight there is actually pushing the seed in the ground. Stocking density is a day-to-day. It's a photograph of the pasture at that moment, and it's the way I can manipulate the grazing pressure to do whatever I want to do on that pasture for managing the forage as the forage grows. And that's a useful term. I'm not going to get into an argument about which is better. Stocking rate has its purposes, but it's not very useful. And I've been doing pasture management for a long time. It's on a day-to-day basis when you're trying to figure out what's going on, and you're going to make movements across the pasture, and you're going to choose this pasture versus that pasture, and how many animals you're going to put in at what time. And then stocking density tells you about grazing pressure. If I want to get rid of certain weeds, I can triple my stocking density for a short period of time and take the and then overgraze on purpose. It's a tool, and that we can use that tool very, very effectively, and we can put numbers on that tool, and that's the important point.
Okay. And we asked, we have a request to repeat the name of the gate latch, and I don't know if you actually gave it a name other than New Zealand style gate latch, but I don't know if you want to put that.
I don't know. My gate latch is called Harvey. No, it's I don't know if it has it. It's probably called a New Zealand style gate latch.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to put that slide up that had.
Let's
see forward from where you're at.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, go a couple more, and then you'll have the contact.
Yeah, the contacts are Jeffers Veterinary Supply, Valley Vet, and Gallagher. Go to North American website, and you'll see them. And these pictures come from those websites. So, yeah, you'll see them. Get one,
Okay.
try it out, and then go from there.
Okay, we got a couple of questions dealing with the last half of the grazing season, late summer, early fall. First one, do you have any recommendations / preferences for extending the grazing season into fall and winter or early spring in the north? And they have Canada in parentheses. So they mentioned rye or stockpile, etc. Any recommendations?
Well, there's a few ways, and we talk about this all the time. I mean, in many places around the where you can go grow tall fescue, particularly if you can get it without endophyte, you can stockpile tall fescue, which is typically done, and in that case they close off the field say early August and fertilize it properly, and there's all sorts of recommendations for that, and then let the stuff grow until the frost, and then you've got standing forage. You don't graze it, you don't do anything to it, and then comes the frost, and then the plants go into dormancy, and then you can move your fence across it and graze the standing forage for months as long as you've got the stuff. Yeah, that's one way. You can plant things like the brassicas, things like turnips, but I'm talking about the forage brassicas, the things that are the relatively new hybrid forage brassicas that are designed for grazing. You can do that and plant those midsummer, and they'll be ready 45 days later, and they'll last well into the winter. You can do something called swath grazing, which is done extensively in parts of Canada, where you plant something like barley in the summer and let it you could probably do it with annual ryegrass as well, but you want a large amount of vegetative growth from midsummer to till the killing frost, and then you can cut that though that into swaths as if windrows, and there's techniques for getting that right, and then you've got windrows that are laying on the ground, and then you need hard ground, you need frozen ground on this, and you can graze across, you move your animals across that. So and there's bale grazing, which is uh, uh, making bales, large bales. You can do baleage or large bales of dry hay, and putting them out in a grid on the field, and then using electric fence, use one bale at a time throughout the winter. So there's a few ways, and the point is an important point is, how do you able to get animals to walk to their feed during the winter, as opposed to going through the entire process of storing hay, feeding hay, getting rid of the manure around a barn. And we actively talk about things like that, to try to find techniques and strategies to do that and extend the grazing season. And grazing doesn't have to be all young grass. It can be what it is. If you're lambing late, I mean, meaning spring, you do not need high quality feed in December. So there's a bunch of, or January. So there's ways of dealing with that. I hope I answered the question. It in itself is a webinar by itself. So there is.
Okay, fair enough. And the other question on the last, I'll just call it the last half of the grazing season. This person has been dealing with a lot of rain, and so fields have gotten past them. So they are interested in mowing now and wondering if there'll be enough late summer into fall growth to get back into good phase 2, or to be a good phase 2. And then they also mentioned that they have several fields with knapweed in them with tall stems that are well into phase 3. Any recommendations there for them?
I'll answer the first one first. I mean the second one first. And I have to look up. Some knapweeds may be toxic, have toxicity, so be careful on that one. If you want to get rid of the stuff, put 100,000 pounds an acre, you'll get rid of knapweed. But I would need to check seriously, Jay, if there's some toxin involved with knapweed, or which knapweed it is. So that's always an issue, always a potential issue with some weeds. But increase the stocking density a lot more. One of the things about people who've not done this before, or newcomers to this concept, is they will tend to, and I did too when I first started on my own place, is I would give them more room. I was afraid I was underestimating I was afraid I was overestimating the amount of feed, and so I would give them more room, so effectively have the low stocking density. And as I became more and more confident in my judgment, I tightened that fencing up to increase the stocking density. And of course, it was working better, but I felt more confident in that it would work better. So it takes a little time to learn these skills. It's not book learning. You got to actually, once you have the principles under your belt, then to apply those takes a lot of experience, and you're adding it together. The first part, what was that first part of the question?
First part was they were looking to mow now and wondering if there'd be enough late summer growth to get back into phase 2 if they were mowing in this part of the summer.
Well, of course, it always depends. But firstly, what type of forages do you have? What type of soil do you have? Do you have enough fertility to do that? Have you seen growth in the past on that? Do you have pastures that will grow? The answer normally would be yes. You should have good fall growth, but you've got to have good fertility and presumably you got a lot of water. But yeah, you can mow now and it'll come back. And mowing now, if you want to take the hay off, you can take the hay off. But if it's raining a lot, that might be hard. But taking hay off removes nutrients from that field. So there's a bunch of things you have to weigh. But if things go okay and you have forages that grow well, fall growth is and a C4, a C3, a cool season grass is normally wood. They come out of the summer slump and they should be growing. But if they're not growing, there's a reason for it. I mean, have you taken the soil test lately? I mean, do you know if there are enough nutrients there to support that growth? So these are all fair questions, but it depends. There are a lot of different aspects to that to finding an answer. And when I work with clients on a one-to-one basis, and I'm not trying to sell myself, by the way, but I'm working with clients, we talk about how that fits. Can you actually do this? Do you have the forage? What forages do you have there? What's the soil? We look at the soil tests. We look at a number of things to say whether or not what are the possibilities of fall growth and what are the risks of it not growing?
Okay.
So,
and Aaron asked this question. Aaron, I see you just raised your hand. Did you want to? I'll go ahead. There you go.
Yeah.
Did you want to go ahead and talk to Woody?
So yeah, as we speak, we're getting poured on again. So we are a soaked sponge, and normally there's quite a variety of forage, particularly in the field of concern that we just moved one of our flocks into. We've got a total of 75 that we get about one rotation a year right now because it's 100 acres. But with this rain and plus we had intense heat, so a lot of the plants kind of bolted. And in this one field, it's the knapweed that's totally stems to blossoms. I guess what I should have asked is if we mowed this knapweed, which we haven't seen any toxicity in our variety, thank goodness, but will those other forages still spring back coming into late summer?
I don't know. I don't know what you have. And
Okay.
I have no idea. I don't know what your soil types are or your soil tests are.
Right. We're around 6 pH, 5, 6. And
yeah, well, the other numbers
soil,
as well.
Yeah, clay soil. We've got a mix of clovers, timothy, vetch, bluegrass, rye.
Well, let me give you an answer because there's other questions as well.
Yes.
There's a lot of things going on there. I mean, a couple of those forages, timothy not being one, but some of the other forages will grow in the fall if the weather is fine and if it stops raining. And if you go through and put 30 pounds of nitrogen on something and see if it grows, 30 pounds per acre I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of ways you can help improve the chances of things growing, but not knowing exactly what's out there and what's the history is, I can't give you an exact answer. I mean,
Right.
that's the type of thing where you need somebody with knowledge to walk across the pasture, take a look at it, and who knows what they're doing.
Right. And in the uniqueness of this year alone too.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could just change and plant paddy rice and go for there.
That's what I'm thinking. Take a canoe out to let the sheep in the next paddock. I might as well use rice.
Might as well use rice. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. And one last question here on the, you had water and minerals move with the sheep, I believe was the slide.
Yes.
Talk about the water. Question on any tips for a covered option for moving minerals with the animals so they don't get kicked over or reined in.
Well, that's firstly, personally, using loose minerals as opposed to a block, I always prefer that. Their intake is higher and they don't break their teeth. And plus, if you need to add something like magnesium, it's really hard to add magnesium to a block that's already in place. But what you're talking about is a design thing. How can you design something that the animals can move, that can you put minerals in and have it covered in a way so that the animals can eat it, but it's got to be physically the equipment's got to be the facility's got to be small enough that you can haul it around. Well, find something you can put on skids. I don't know what your operation is like, but if you use a four-wheeler, something, or even if you can just physically pull it, put it on skids of some sort, and you can make skids. I mean, these are sheep. Cattle is much harder because they're harder on equipment. But sheep, they can bang it up a little bit, nothing like what cattle can do. So, you put them on skids. Maybe you can have PVC pipe as your skids, or who knows what, old skis for that matter, and put the thing on skids. And there are, I'm sure, a whole bunch of designs that you could probably find online for that. But the concept is, so it's movable, and if you necessary, depending on how many animals you have, you could pull it. You just pull it across the fence and put it in the next paddock. So I pull it, pull through the gate or under the gate, so that it's movable, small enough, and there's nothing to say that you can't have two or three of them if they're really small. And then it depends on how many animals you have, and so that you can move these things. What you don't want is something placed in place so that the animals have to go to all the time, no matter what paddock they're in, kind of like spokes on a wheel thing, because then all around there you get a mud pie and you've lost complete control of your forage in those areas. So something that moves with the animals is important. And then you have rain, you gotta have a bit of a design for that. And there's some designs out there. And the same thing with water. What I showed about the watering thing is exquisitely designed for moving. I mean, this thing, I have my own and I move it. I mean, it doesn't, I would suggest that you have a hose that comes out to about here and make your attachment there for the new hoses each time. So you're not screwing around with the PVC pipe. So in any case, I hope that answers the question, but you can get designs online, I'm absolutely sure, but make sure the thing's small enough that you can move it either on your own place if you have to pull it by hand, which is not a big deal. If if it's light enough, it's small enough, and you only have a few sheep. But if you got more than that, if you use a four-wheeler, then you can easily hook it on the back of a four-wheeler and drag it 50 yards. So.
Okay, thanks, Woody. And yeah, we've run long here. I appreciate all the questions that have come in. We have had several questions come in the last few minutes. And I'm going to go ahead and share those with you, Woody, with the email and contact email name of the people that asked them. If you put a question in and rather I not share that, just let me know. Just drop me an email and let me know that you'd rather I not share it. But we've had some good questions come in on some different related topics with moving sheep and mowing in particular.
Jay, has a couple of things. Number one, if someone's written questions, you want to send them to me by email, that's fine, but I'm not really going to answer them by email. Someone puts their phone number in there, I'll talk to them on the phone. As a private consultant, I know the importance of knowing who I'm talking to and what their operation is like. And the generalized answers are just that, generalized answers. But if they want to find out more details about a lot of what I've said, get my book. That's blatant commercialism, and I apologize for that. But a lot of what I've talked about is in more detail with background stories in my book called Capturing Sunlight. So that would be helpful for them. And there is some humor in there, but that's in the eye of the reader.
Okay, well, if you wouldn't mind, then I'll ask I could ask the three main questions that have come in a general sense. Okay, so one of them has to do with soil temperature and ground cover. Grazing down to different levels and having soil temperature, keeping soil temperatures cool and whatnot. Would you like to address that at all? Bare ground issues at all?
Bare ground is bare ground.
Yeah.
And in good grazing, and we're talking about improved pastures, you want the ground covered at all times with green solar panels. So if you have bare ground, you got a problem. Don't have bare ground. Seriously. And if there is bare ground there, kind of think back about why it's bare ground and find ways of covering it with forage. And I'll use the word grass, but it could be any type of forage. And one of the principles of good soil management is keep the ground covered. I'm
Okay.
not a soil scientist, but I've heard that many, many times from soil people. Keep the
The,
ground.
the question mentioned specifically trampled grass. Is that a good purpose for trampled
Oh yeah,
grass too? Yeah.
oh yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And in fact, one of the places that I work with uses some mob grazing, and they come in with really long rest periods. That's part of the whole system, and they come in at maybe 200, 250,000 pounds an acre for a day, and then they move to the next one and next one. But they leave a lot of trampled. They leave a lot of the thatch, you might say, on the bottom. I mean, trample stuff. But the thing about what that does is it firstly there is a coverage. It does prevent evapotranspiration. It reduces the amount of evapotranspiration. You get a lot of winds and hot weather, you can lose a lot of moisture out of that soil, which of course puts plants under stress. And having trampled, I'm not saying the design is to have lots of trampled stuff, but it doesn't necessarily do the harm you think. Because if you have open ground that's in the sun and is baking in the sun, it's going to not only become hard, but it's going to lose moisture at tremendous rates. And then without moisture, the plants just go dormant.
Okay. And the other one that's come in, 2 or 3 people have asked about parasites and the rotation schedule and stocking density. Basically, higher stocking density that increase the issue with parasites, and should they be rotating more often? I don't know how
Well,
much you want to get into that.
let me very, very clearly, rotational grazing does not stop parasite control. I know it's been repeated many times online and it's wrong. You do rotational or intensive grazing, you're actually grazing close, within a couple of inches of the ground, and there's going to be parasites there. You're going to have to find a way of treating that. But just moving animals around rotationally does not reduce the parasite load.
Okay. And there was one other one, but they have left. So they asked about animal performance and stocking density forced them to eat less desirable plants. Is there an issue there to be concerned about?
Well, you firstly have to define what less desirable plants are. All forages are high quality at some time during their early part of their life, all of them. If you let it go to bamboo, it's going to be low quality. It also depends on what animals you're talking about. Do you have dry ewes? Do you have ewes trying to raise twins? Do you want fast growing lambs? I would never put fast growing lambs in places where I'm going to stock so heavily that that they're going to eat things I don't want them to eat. So there's a lot of juggling going on there and a lot of judgment. But for example, if you wean the lambs from the ewes, then you have 2 different flocks. You've got dry ewes or drying out ewes, and you've got fast growing lambs. They go to different parts of different pastures, or put the lambs in first and then put the ewes to follow them within a 5-day rule. So there's a lot of different options there. I kind of, if you let the animals eat just chocolate, they will be very happy and they'll grow the fastest. But you have to decide what you want to do on your property. And if managing forages well and being able to, here's the main thing. By managing forages very well, we are able to reduce the amount of money we spend on feed. And I say money, I'm talking about all expenses, and you're an economist, Jay. All the expenses that go into feeding animals. And if we can feed animals by having them walk to their feed, that's considerably less expensive than any other way. And if we can do that, that reduces our general expense and, feed costs, what, 70, 60, 80% of a budget. And if we can reduce that by 10 or 15 or 20%, that allows us to handle some lower prices and still stay in business. So you have to, if you want animal performance, feed them corn. I mean, or keep them in phase 2 the whole time if you're lucky. But if you're also trying to manage the pastures as part of the operation, then you've got some choices to make, and we can do both. But you got to be very skilled at it. I'm not sure if I answered the question or just confused people, but Jay. But in general, this is a very complicated question concerning animal performance.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, it is. So anyway, thank you for taking those questions. And
Yeah.
I know we've run long here, and some people have asked about this being recorded. It is being recorded, and I will get that recording posted either later this evening or sometime tomorrow. But everybody will be getting a follow-up email that will have a link to the recording and a link to access the slides that Woody used here tonight. So they'll be available in PDF format for you to review if you'd like to look at any of them. With that, I want to just remind everybody that we definitely thank the American Sheep Industry Association for providing funding for these webinars, and encourage you to go visit their website at sheepusa.org to access some of the educational materials that they have posted there, including past recordings of the webinars. And I really want to give a shout out to Woody and thank him for coming on and sharing his expertise with us this evening, and really appreciate him doing that. And I know that we'll get a lot of views of this webinar, as we have of webinars that Woody has done for us in the past. So thank you, Woody.
Thank you, Jay. It's been a pleasure, and I'm glad to share this material. And you can see why when I teach these classes, courses, the courses last 6 to 8 weeks, and we're trying to squeeze a lot of that into a 1 hour webinar. So I talked fast, but it's really actually pretty complicated stuff.
It is, and I appreciate you sharing it with us, and I certainly appreciate everybody being on tonight. And gosh, we still have 70-some people that are on this late hour, so it's fantastic. A lot of interest, and really wish everybody well, and wish everybody a good evening. And thank you for joining us.